Okay, Anna Maria, Brian, and McKay. I guess for the average person, they say, I don't really see chemicals. I don't see it in my water. I don't see it in my food. I don't really see it in my furniture or carpet. It's probably not that big a deal. It's probably not that big a deal. So why is this something that you guys think is a big enough deal that you write books about it, you talk about it? Like, what do you know that the general public doesn't seem to be aware of, or doesn't just seem to be as concerned? In other words, if we talk about high fructose corn syrup, a lot of people say, hey, I'm concerned about that. But when it comes to chemicals, while there are some people that are very concerned, there's a lot of people that'll make a face like, what do you mean, what's the problem? So what is the big problem? What concerns you that you wrote books and lecture on this?
Well, I'll take a crack at that. I teach a lot of university students, and I can give you some field experience from what educated people don't know about this subject. So if you ask most people, including college students, what they think of when they think of pollution, they still, even at the age of 20, will say something like trash, and they'll equate environmentalism with recycling, and that's about as deep as their thinking on the subject goes. The problem with this is that these pollutants we're talking about are essentially invisible to most people. Invisible actually physically, and also invisible in terms of any kind of media awareness of it. Standard journalism is not particularly aware of this. So there's that thing you have to overcome. There's also the problem that even if you talk to people about this, they won't be able to draw the connection, because it's very difficult to say, maybe impossible to say, that one chemical causes one disease. So if you end up with a cancer of some sort, you're never going to be able to prove that it was that bisphenol A that caused it, or it was the flame retardants that caused it when you slept on some bad mattress 30 years ago, or it was the pesticides that your neighbor sprays. There's no way to equate one thing with one disease, which is why this problem is so difficult to deal with in the court system, because it's impossible to prove that one thing causes one disease. So this stuff is physically invisible. It's kind of, in terms of like the media optics, it's invisible because the media doesn't cover it. And in terms of being able to equate one thing with another, either in your own mind or if you ever do get sick in a court of law, it's virtually impossible. And of course, the companies that make these chemicals know that. They are essentially impregnable for lawsuits, because they'll just say, how can you possibly prove that this product of ours caused you a problem? Cigarettes were one of the very few things where you could draw a direct link, and that's why after 30 years of every kind of legal movement, they finally had some success with that. But virtually every other product you can think of is virtually impossible to connect to a particular disease, which makes it a very hard problem to connect.
When you start with a raw material like petroleum-based material to make clothes, for example, you add about 8,000 different chemicals to make a finished product. And this is going to go out in our wastewater, and really half of all the pollutions we have in water is wastewater from these factories. And we see at the Institute, a lot of people come and have heavy metal contamination, and anything from cancer, asthma, you name it, can be an end result of these heavy metals. So like you say, a lot of these things, we have no clue what is brought into our water, what we breathe in this air, because everything circulates, and eventually it gets into our bodies. And of course, it's very dear to us about clothes, so we'll talk more about that.
Well, Rachel Carlson spoke about this, I think, in 1961. And, it's a silent killer. And it's much worse today. Just some numbers we'll run by. Back then, we had 3.5, 4 billion people. Today, we have over 7 billion people. So we're using double the amount of chemistry. Every single year, 2,000 brand new chemicals are created that did not exist last year. So somebody somewhere in a laboratory being paid by the petrochemical industry, is literally inventing something that has no control of any significance placed on it, so it's allowed to be poured into the environment. And these are invisible. They're not marked. If you look at Canada, Canada, again, is a canary in the coal mine because it was the very first country back in 2008 that the #1 disease killer became cancer. Even here in the United States, it's still heart disease. This year, next year, it may be edged out by cancer. But why? This was sort of very confusing, perplexing to me. And a Canadian friend of mine looked at me and smiled and said, "Have you ever heard of mining?" Because most of the mining being done all of the mining in North America pretty much, and most of the mining in the world is being done in countries like that where they have small populations of 32 million, but massive landmass. And that's in the air, it's in the water. Fracking, I mean, we could do a 10-hour panel of 50 people on fracking alone. I mean, not long ago in Oklahoma, they've actually admitted that they know fracking is causing 4,000 additional earthquakes a day. Not a week, not a year, not in 10 years, a day. Within 24 hours after they agreed with the research scientists that showed that to them, the legislature said, well, let's make a law so that nowhere in Oklahoma can you deny fracking. So they said, yes, it's causing earthquake, but by the way, 20 hours later, we're going to make a law so you can't prevent fracking from going on. We put a story that was even stunning to me. You know, I'm not often surprised, but I was surprised. A young man that lived at 11,000 feet in the Rocky Mountains for 30 years, drank out of his own well, moved up there to be away from people, to live naturally, lived a pretty healthy diet. Ended up with a rash all over his body. Went to 10, 15 doctors. It was pretty severe. He couldn't sleep. He was scratching it, was bleeding. Somebody who had been through the Hippocrates program went and suggested it may be fracking, not knowing that they didn't frack in the Rocky Mountains where he lived. So he dismissed it, and because everything else failed, he checked into it, and guess what? At 11,000 feet, it was fracking that was going on hundreds of miles away. That the aquifer somehow went there. So this is such an enormous issue. You know, I see a lot of very conscious people focusing on a lot of subjects, but this is one I see even the most conscious people often throw their hands up, and it's the biggest issue. There's no doubt that in my work, our medical team has clearly, as many others, established that the #1 reason cancer is going to hit 57% of us now is chemicals and heavy metals. No question. That's definitely the #1 cause. Bad diet doesn't help, but when you put bad diet on top of what's festering inside of the human cell that mutates the cell, it's a chemical or a heavy metal that does that. And mental illness, I think, has in part to do with this. And if you look at areas where you have higher pollutants, factory towns, et cetera, you have much higher amounts of mental illness because it throws out bacteria in the intestinal tract. So we could go on for hours with this, but let's go to the next question.